the idea that culture is an expression of rationality, as Richard Rorty has suggested. This view of culture presupposes a common set of practices that function as the reassurance of a shared cultural comportment, namely that you and I are sufficiently similar. When widely shared, this cultural perspective appears as the dominant norm, or a universality. The uncritical equation of a set of norms with rationality establishes such norms as universal and renders them beyond dispute, except in those cases where differences are understood as mere preferences rather than deep-seated beliefs or cultural ontology. This view of culture renders the dissenter, she who does not share the dominant norm, an outsider and a threat to the singularity of that culture. The mark of strangeness precipitates the question of loyalties, commitments, allegiances. This is why assimilation becomes such an important imperative. We tend to believe that those who accept and internalize our norms are more likely to share our allegiances. As a result, they are less likely to betray us. But radical heterogeneity is more than merely difference or strangeness. It is a threat to a shared culture. Radical heterogeneity represents a challenge to the values of a liberal secular political order and to reasonable and law-abiding members of the polity. Those who are affiliated with such heterogeneous practices are by extension understood as unruly creatures. They're considered irrational and thought to share few characteristics with rational human beings, who by definition ascribe to the prevailing cultural regime. Their public perception as a threat, even a potential insurgence to a current regime, prompts a political or sovereign response that would suppress this political threat. Judith Butler has already pointed to this phenomenon. Referring to the 1991 invasion of Iraq by the US, she says, "The Arab other is understood to be radically outside the structure of democracy and reason, and hence calls to be brought forcibly within." The fear of betrayal to outside force prompts the concern that radical heterogeneity is threatening. As such, the perceived danger of radical cultural heterogeneity is treated with a fundamental hostility from sovereign institutions, and this hostility is directed towards individuals whose comportment seems to threaten the fundamental political order on which the state is based. And that treatment is often naturalized. It's naturalized as the proper response of a state towards a threat to its people. As William Galston states, liberal public institutions may restrict the activities of individuals and groups for several reasons. Among them, to guard, he has a list, I choose only one here. Among them, to guard the boundary separating legitimate from illegitimate variations among ways of life. The practice of distinguishing legitimate from illegitimate variations enables the state to justify why certain populations, especially if the members of that population are seen to be culturally homogeneous, are not entitled to its promise of universal protection. As Galston says, value pluralism is not relativism. The distinction between good and bad, between good and evil, is objective and rationally defensible. Galston, like many who write in the tradition of liberalism, reserves the capacity to make judgments about who is sufficiently acceptable for membership in a polity. This reservation is often explicitly stated without a conceptual or logical explanation of the grounds of inclusion or exclusion. Galston reserves this distinction because he accepts, implicitly, that in a modern culture of liberal toleration, cultural difference alone is not a sufficient reason to deprive a group of rights. It is significant cultural difference, seen as a threat to other reasonable and hence law-abiding members of the polity, which is understood as holding the potential for criminality. In the case of Muslims, for example, the actions of the Group of 19 on 9/11 have become a synecdoche, a stand-in for the nature and the unique cultural practices of all members of that ethnic and cultural group. And thus this synecdoche reinforces the perception of the entire group as engaging in a set of culturally heterogeneous practices that emerge through the affinity of another tradition or another god, and thus another law than the culture that binds us as a community. Just a couple of quick examples off the top of my head. There are two girls, teenage girls in Queens who were detained a couple years ago for wearing the hijab. Crossing paths while being escorted through INS in the United States. They apparently gave each other some kind of greeting, which I could never figure out what that greeting was. I think it was just salam alaikum. And on that basis, were both taken into custody on the grounds that there was a conspiracy to to be suicide bombers. One of them was eventually deported with her family. Those were the only grounds on which she could be released. We now have a group of children in Texas who are being detained. So it's not clear to me and they're Muslim, and it's not clear to me what the connection is between this and this idea that Muslim culture at large is about terrorism. Hence, these practices are seen as profane or criminal practices, that is, as transgressing or departing from the common culture that members of a group should share. If we can ascribe this interpretation to a given group, then we might better understand the logic behind the preemptive hunt for potential terrorists qua enemies. The idea of innocent until proven guilty does not apply to those who are not like us or not human like us. And I use the us advisedly in this case. Section 2, John Rawls, Islam, Madness, and the Menace to Liberalism. You can tell I'm getting dramatic sitting in my ivory tower at Berkeley. And I'm going to spare you my discussion of Huntington, although he was originally also in this section. Consider the threat of radical cultural difference as it has been articulated by John Rawls. In Rawls's Law of Peoples, he offers the imaginary example of a decent, hierarchical Muslim people called Kazakhstan. Elsewhere, he calls Kazakhstan Islamic. Rawls's use of this example is notable for its ascribed assumptions and features. The people of Kazakhstan are hierarchical because they do not allow non-Muslims to stand for office, although they may be in the armed forces in higher ranks of command. And just think of the resonances between this and certain practices in liberal secular orders. They are non-liberal because they do not accept the separation of religion from the state, and they are decent as a technical term in Rawls, because they are not aggressive towards others. They observe the law of peoples and accept and respect human rights. They're also decent because they do not arbitrarily discriminate against non-Muslims, nor do they treat them as inferior in social or political relations. And because, quote, unlike most Muslim rulers, they have not sought empire and territory. This is because their theologians understand jihad in a moral and spiritual sense and not in military terms. It was 1999. These statements offer a narrow view, even patronizing, of Muslims who are portrayed as either sympathetic to and thus decent, or in tension with liberal tenets, and thus hierarchical and non-liberal. More hopefully, Rawls insists that this hypothetical people might be able to accommodate the needs of a range of groups in the spirit of cooperation and to respect the religious minorities within Kazakhstan. Moreover, the members of government who disagree with government policies must be able to express dissent. This dissent must be respected through responses that explain, quote, how the government thinks it can both reasonably interpret its policies in line with its common good idea of justice and impose duties and obligations on all members of society, unquote. Meeting these goals would establish this Muslim people as not only decent, but also reasonable, in part because they might instigate changes in the direction of liberal reforms. But, suggests a resigned Rawls, while this will not render Kazakhstan a just society, it can nevertheless be decent. And this is truly the best that we can hope for from a non-liberal people. For Rawls, Muslims are non-liberal because they are unreasonable. That is, they do not accept the premises of liberal public reason, namely that public reason should be formal and not substantive. And the unreasonable is that which is strange, even bizarrely unfamiliar, and thus unacceptable. Here is how the logic is couched. Rawls insists that public reason applies only to politics and not other features of one's life. By extension, public reason employs a political conception of justice, which is procedural and not substantive. In other words, comprehensive doctrines, that is, those that have at their core certain moral or religious beliefs, cannot be the foundation of public reason, nor of an ideal liberal democracy. The reason behind the exclusion of comprehensive doctrines from the space of politics is that deep-seated moral, religious, or philosophical beliefs ultimately can offer neither authoritative guidance nor rational superiority in debates about the distribution of goods, because they are ultimately personal individual beliefs. Were we to argue about religious or moral beliefs, the argument continues, we would get into an infinite battle that ultimately can never be concluded except perhaps through violence or force, and hence is itself an unreasonable avenue to resolve this debate. It applies to one group but not another. and which is ultimately not relevant to questions of political, procedural democratic conceptions of justice. There are other several remarkable factors in Rawls's description. The first is the insistence that a liberal secular political